Hi, good evening. Welcome to the show. I'm Mayor Weinstein. I'll be joined tonight with a guest that we've had on many times, Mayor Jolowitz. He was former director of the Zionist Organization of America. He lectures on campus. He writes widely in Jewish media about issues concerning the Jewish people and Israel. Tonight, we're going to be discussing the the big issue that's going on in Israel, judicial reform. Are elections valid anymore in Israel? The Likud party, together with their coalition partners, they have 64 seats. They managed to get the vote of the Jewish majority in Israel. Approximately 70% of the Jews of Israel voted for this coalition. There are left-wing radical protests breaking out, a combination between left-wing Jews and Arabs, and the Arab parties in Israel don't recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Their slogan is democracy, and the government that was voted in is anti-democratic, and that the judicial reform that's being proposed by this coalition government is anti-democratic. We're going to be discussing that tonight. What we are seeing is mob rule, threats, violence, taking over streets, intimidation, and by the left. And finally, last night, what we saw was a counter protest by the right, by religious Jews, by all Jews that believe Israel has a right to exist as a strong Jewish state. They brought out, without funding, over 100,000 Jews into the streets in Jerusalem. I believe there's going to be a similar protest tomorrow night in Tel Aviv by these same Jews. The media has been portraying this, that it's Netanyahu has no support, that this coalition has no support, that the left is rising. The reality is there's a demographic shift going on in Israel, primarily within the Orthodox Jewish community. They have the fastest birth rate, and they're very active in Israel. They serve in the army, they serve in high tech, they contribute to the country. And the elitists on the left denigrate them, treat them worse than second-class citizens. We're going to be discussing all these issues tonight. Mayor, can you hear me? Mayor Jolowitz, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can I be heard?
I can hear you clearly.
Okay.
Mayor, it's been ever since the elections, the left wing is going completely crazy. Yair Lapid, whose wife, I'm not sure if she's converted to Christianity or some kind of Jews for Jesus. We got a real mess on the left. And it seems that the Jews who are on the right, who identify with the right, they want Israel as a Jewish state. That's it. What could you tell the viewers who are watching us tonight?
Okay. Let me begin with this, just a footnote to the brief introduction that you gave. You'd mentioned that I speak frequently, I appear different places. It's true. I write prolifically. I lecture on a regular weekly basis, actually. I lecture also when invited beyond the normal scheduled lectures. But there was one thing which you're actually not correct about when you said that I also appear, I don't know if you said frequently, on college campuses. That is no longer the case. That used to be the case. The reason I don't appear on college campuses, I'm here in Arizona, is because the message that I deliver, which is a strong pro-Israel position, it basically says that one needs to dedicate themselves to a safe and secure Israel. It is by virtue of that that we have been labeled right-wing. And being pro-Israel today, as opposed to a generation and a half ago, 2 generations ago, is considered controversial. And a lot of Jewish organizations, the Hillels on campuses throughout the United States, don't want what they consider to be Jewish controversy or controversial subjects. So the reality is, notwithstanding the fact that I'm seen as having a certain expertise in any aspect of discussion of Israeli affairs, the college campus is actually not open to me because they don't want to hear a position which is as openly pro-Israel as it is. So that by way of footnote.
Right.
I'll begin by this because I know what the subject matter is for us today. We want to talk about the struggle that we see, the civil strife in Israel, the divide between political persuasions. It isn't just political parties, it's political ideologies. And as I've mentioned more than once on this broadcast, there is a war going on, and it's a war of ideas. So let me just say this as a preface to the remarks I'm going to make later today. Israel is a Western democracy in every sense. And what makes Israel very much like other normal Western democracies is the fact that there is a certain division of power. It's called a balance of power that exists, which is endemic to these Western democracies. That division of power is usually divided into 3 segments. And we know what they are. They are the executive. In the case of Israel, it's the prime minister. It's the case of the legislator, which the legislative branch, which in Israel is the Knesset. And it is the judiciary, which in Israel, the supreme voice is the Supreme Court. That happens to be true of most Western democracies. The fight that we see going on today in Israel is that since 1992, that imbalance of the balance of power was in evidence with the passing of certain basic laws manufactured at the time by not yet President of the Supreme Court, Aharon Barak. A couple of years later, became the President of the Supreme Court. At the time, he was just a justice. And it basically said that the Supreme Court was permitted to usurp certain powers which were otherwise not available to it. And once again, by way of footnote, I should mention for those who don't know, Israel, unlike many Western democracies, does not have a constitution. It was always intended in 1949 and 1950, there was an attempt to establish a constitution, and at the time, the scholars thought it could be done within a year or 2. And here it is, we're almost 75 years later, and there's no constitution. So what Israel did is it has adopted a series of what they call basic laws, capital B, capital L, basic laws, which almost serve as amendments to the Constitution that doesn't exist. And it was during the discussion of specific basic laws that the Supreme Court was able to wrestle away some of the authority which was in essence not granted to it, which instead belonged to either the Prime Minister or to the Knesset. And it was only with the re-election of Prime Minister Netanyahu, part of the campaign that he ran was that there would be judicial reform as opposed to what we had experienced before, which went by the nomenclature judicial tyranny. And it didn't sit well with the liberal or leftist world. One last comment before we move on, and it's something which we will discuss, I think, throughout this conversation, is that in Israel, on November 1st of last year, 2022, there was an election. It was a democratically staged election, and the party that won was the Likud as far as the most votes, the most seats in the Knesset, 32. And of the 120, they needed 61 in order to rule. Well, they got 64 with the coalition government that they put together. Now, one might think that 64 out of 120 isn't a significant enough number to do the things that they want to do. And one is reminded that in the previous Naftali Benny Gantz Mansour Abbas coalition, They had 61. And for everyone in the Western world, for the leftists in academia, for the media, and certainly for the liberals and leftists in Israel, 61, they said, was more than enough to govern. Democratically, it was the majority. And then they lost one, and they continued to rule with 60. And they lost another, and they had 59. And even with 59, they were, by the structures of the rules of Israel, still allowed to govern until there was a re-election. In that re-election, as I said, the right-leaning, I think it's a mistake for people to suggest that Bibi Netanyahu is a right-winger. He's certainly not a right-winger. He leans moderately right, is what he does. But his coalition partners are more right-wing. Therefore, we've got this tag of being a right-wing government. And for some reason, we've seen it in America with Trump, the liberal left isn't willing to accept that the other side won. So all of a sudden, democracy is subverted when they simply say, we will not recognize the results of the election, and they needed to pick a reason not to accept it. And the reason they picked is what we'll be discussing today. It's the whole issue of judicial reform as opposed to judicial tyranny.
Well put. Well put. Excuse me. You've discussed it before at length on previous shows, how the Supreme Court was changed by Aharon Barak in the early 90s. If you could explain that a little bit to our viewers, and then we can move on to more substance of what's going on today, because I'm not sure if everyone is aware of the history of how it happened.
Okay. I'll mention it in the most simplistic terms. That's all one needs to know in the most simplistic terms. This balance of power ostensibly did exist until 1992, prior to the establishment of this specific basic law. When Aharon Barak, he is retired today, still opines. He is associated with Reichman University in Herzliya, and he's by every regard is considered quite an intellectual. And perhaps it's by virtue of his intellect that he was able to actually sort of railroad a new direction of the interpretation of the Supreme Court powers rules, and it went unchallenged. The problem is now Likud, it was always the Labor government that was in power until May 17, 1977. And after that, Likud finally had its turn to govern, and it was something which didn't sit well with at the time, the opposition, the Labor Party and the other leftist parties which aligned themselves with Labor. In 1992, we'd already had a number of years of Likud government. We had it with Menachem Begin. We had it then again with Yitzhak Shamir. And the problem that was faced by people who supported the balance of power was the fact that Barak slipped in this notion that the Supreme Court would have more power than it was otherwise allowed to have by the rules which established and governed the first generation of Israel's jurisprudence. And it wasn't challenged. And what he did when he became the president of the Supreme Court 95, 96, is he pushed it even further. And he kept pushing the envelope, and because he was considered a scholar of the first order, it was allowed to get by to the point where it then became almost a fait accompli. It did. And over the next generation, we saw the Supreme Court in Israel come and legislate on certain matters. This is what the two issues were. And there are more than two, but there are two that are being fought about today. The first one is that the Supreme Court has allowed itself the right to appoint its own successors, unquestioned. In Israel, the Supreme Court numbers 15. They can rule for as long as they want until the calendar tells us that they reach their 70th birthday. And when they reach their 70th birthday, they need to step down. And when they step down, one or two or three of them, they are replaced by a vote of their own colleagues with a like-minded political ideology, and it remains left-leaning. That is the first issue which the Bibi Netanyahu coalition is trying to change. And when I say the coalition, for perspective, once again, we're talking about the religious Zionism, which is really made up of Bezalel Smotrich, and also the Otzma Yehudit, which is Itamar Ben Gvir, and the other two parties which are part of this coalition, United Torah Judaism and Shas, both religious parties. They have their reasons to be adamant about getting judicial reform, because over the last generation and a half, 2 generations, this Supreme Court, which leans heavily left, has been viciously anti-religious in all its pronouncements. So that is the first issue. The second issue, again, the first issue is that they self-appoint, which means that the political perspective remains theirs. The second issue is the fact that they have assigned themselves the right to overrule any legislation which is passed by the Knesset. No matter how large the vote is to pass certain legislation, they have decided that they have a right to overrule legislation. And there's an additional provision many people don't talk about. They actually have a right, at least they have usurped the right, to suggest if legislation is being debated in the Knesset, that they can actually preempt and say, don't bother, guys, we're not going to accept it. They have made decisions about Israel which were purely the purview of the military. They have decided, for example, whether or not Israel has the right to take certain actions in either Gaza or perhaps up north. They have decided whether or not those actions are deemed legitimate by the Supreme Court. Military decisions. Beyond that, they've taken upon themselves the ability to say, for example, in Israel, there was a tradition, should we call it, whereas if a terrorist with blood in his hands murdered an Israeli, the administrative justice that was meted against the terrorist or the family was that they would sometimes destroy the house that was home to the terrorist, especially if it was supportive of his actions. And if not, they destroyed one room, a bedroom, in the home of a terrorist. And the Supreme Court was the final arbiter. The Arabs appealed. The Arabs, by the way, who have on many occasions said the Supreme Court is the only real friend we have in Israel. If that doesn't say everything, that should be the end of the conversation, actually. But the only real friend that they have in Israel is the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overwhelmingly votes with them. There was an issue which we won't discuss here, but there were in the history of Israel, there have been 5,000 cases of intermarriage, and by intermarriage, I'm talking about Jew and Arab. In almost all the cases, it was a Jewish woman marrying an Arab man. In many, many, many of those cases, she ends up in an Arab village living on his turf. Often she converts to Islam, but nonetheless, the children are raised as Muslims. So there was a challenge. There were a couple of women who ran away. They were brought in for shelter in Israel by organizations which were deemed racist because they interfered in personal lives. And a case or two actually went to the Supreme Court a number of years ago. Now, those who know the issue of the religions, in the Jewish religion, if the mother is Jewish, the child is deemed by Jewish law to be Jewish. Within the Islamic tradition, Islamic law, if the father is a Muslim, then the child is a Muslim. So we have an inevitable conflict. The father is a Muslim, the mother is a Jew, the child doesn't know what it, and so it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, you know where I'm going with this, said, no brainer, the child is a Muslim. So on all these issues, the Supreme Court has taken upon itself to decide things which it is not in a position to decide. When we talk about religion, once again, I throw this in by way of footnote, because these are the little things that make up the greater argument. Aharon Barak who's the architect of this, has admitted, and as I say, he's a brilliant man with an extraordinarily high IQ. But when talking about Jewish issues, and in Israel, Jewish issues are often discussed in the Knesset. The most famous historically, of course, who was the Jew vote, in which which 5 Arab votes actually took.
Right.
The Arabs are deciding. Well, Aharon Barak admitted that he doesn't know the words to the Shema Yisrael. Okay, the cornerstone of Judaism. Now, he is a brilliant man. He's probably memorized law verbatim, but he doesn't know the Shema Yisrael, which is fine. But it's not fine that the man who doesn't know the Shema Yisrael by heart, and it's not a long prayer, it's not fine that he gets to arbitrate and decide and choose what Israel will be when it comes to Jewish issues. It's illegitimate. So those are the two issues, Mayor. The first issue is, does the Supreme Court have a right to self-appoint its successors as they step down? And the second is, does the Supreme Court have the right to overrule legislation by the Knesset, notwithstanding the fact that it might have passed by overwhelming numbers by the representatives of the people who voted for them? So the second element is quite simple, that a group of 15 people get to choose, very important, unelected people. 15 unelected people get the authority to basically overrule laws which were agreed upon by legislators who were in fact democratically elected. And that is what the fight is all about.
I think there's another element in there as well. There is the Attorney General, and I'm not aware of an Attorney General in any other Western country, we include Canada in that actually attacks the government that was elected and actively goes after the Prime Minister. And that's what I see going on in Israel. How does that work? What is...
I'm sorry. It's happened with the present Attorney General. It happened with the previous Attorney General. The previous who brought charges against Bibi Netanyahu. Attorney General basically represents, because he's chosen by the party in power, with an approval of the Knesset and such, but nonetheless, Israel's present Attorney General was actually selected by Gideon Sa'ar. He was the person who actually, but became Attorney General during the Yair Lapid stint. The Naftali Bennett followed by Yair Lapid stint. One could say that they have a dog in the race. They were selected. The Israeli Prime Minister not only was told that he doesn't have a right to dismiss the Attorney General, which, by the way, isn't actually clear according to Israeli law. That is a controversial opinion. But the Attorney General, in the case that we now face, because Bibi Netanyahu was indicted for certain minor crimes which were not considered crimes anywhere else in the Western world, he was told by the Attorney General that he wasn't allowed to speak at all. He wasn't allowed to opine about the conflict that we've just described with the Supreme Court.
Right.
Bibi Netanyahu is, in fact, the person who was elected Prime Minister of Israel. He's the most powerful voice. He's certainly an articulate, whether you like him or don't, he's an articulate voice, both in Hebrew and certainly in English. He used to have that incredible power of persuasion in the Western world, but the Western world has turned on him quite dramatically because they don't like his politics. And he basically was told to be silent. And he was, in fact, silent. And while he was silent, the left, the left in Israel, by what it does, borderlines on evil. And yet they are not stupid. And what they did is they took advantage of the fact that the spokesman for the other side, for the government, was in essence neutralized. He couldn't speak. And that is when they made their move. I have spoken in the past, and I often lecture about the twin threats that Israel faces, as other countries do as well. There is the external threat, but particularly Israel, surrounded by enemies which for 75 years have tried to destroy Israel, and you have the internal threat. The internal threat were the political fights that you had among political parties, political ideologies. However, historically, anytime the external threat was such that Israel needed to defend itself, there was more or less, sometimes more, sometimes less, an ability to harness a collective voice that the external threat was existential, and therefore we'll put aside our domestic quarrel in order to somehow make sure that we're safe against that external threat. Well, that no longer is the case. Today, the opposition power, the same power that was in government for a year with the Naftali Bennett, Benny Gantz, and Mansour Abbas coalition, they actually have done things which have threatened Israel's ability to defend itself against that external threat. And they did so unabashedly. So what we have in Israel today, for the first time, is we have an internal threat which was equal to the threat that comes from the outside. And I say it's equal, not because of any tanks that it has, because I describe this as a war of ideas. And they have been allowed because the academia is behind them, but more importantly, which is also the case in America, the media. It's the media. So the whole notion that the founding forefathers in America and elsewhere, the Magna Carta, the truth is self-evident. The truth is not self-evident. It isn't. And the media decides what will be true and what isn't. And what we see in the streets of Israel, when we see 160,000 people demonstrating in Tel Aviv, the tragedy is, and I've seen people interviewed, I've seen quite a number of people interviewed, and they were asked, why are you demonstrating against this government? And it was borderline violent in their demonstrations. They all gave the same answer, a uniform answer. We're doing it in order to preserve democracy, which is exactly the antithesis. It's the opposite. It's the inverse. It's the inverse of what was happening. When asked, what is it that you are concerned about with this destruction of democracy that you say is attributed to this new government, the new Benjamin Netanyahu coalition government, the answer they give is, that's their answer. They don't know. There isn't even a voice who can articulate it. When asked a follow-up question, which went like this, don't you think that a government that was elected democratically on November 1st of last year, don't they have a right to rule the way that the people had chosen it to rule? And isn't your attempt to stop that actually the subversion of democracy? They refuse to hear it. It doesn't matter. The truth isn't self-evident, and the notion that the truth always prevails, anyone who knows anything about history, is nonsense. It ought to prevail. It doesn't.
Right. There's another element that's going on with these left-wing demonstrators. They have been also demonstrating outside of random synagogues in Israel. On Shabbat, after Shabbat, there's even video where they're throwing money at Orthodox Jews. This is like an anti-Semitic trope that's used by anti-Semitic neo-Nazi groups, KKK groups in other countries. There's even reports of women taking off their shirts in front of Orthodox Jews while services are going on. There's absolutely no respect. They hate Judaism. So we have that going on. On the other hand, like I said last night, there was finally from the right a counter protest with over 100,000 Jews who identify with on the right. And today you have members of the Knesset from Yair Lapid's party that are arguing, saying that two groups who are part of the right-wing demonstration should be listed as terrorist organizations.
Yes.
One is Levava, who campaigns against intermarriage. I mean, it's in the Torah, not to intermarry. And another group, La Familia, that they're at a lot of soccer games, football games, and very patriotic. And what's their crime? When they were at the counter protest, they're yelling at the left-wing fanatics. And therefore, these members of Knesset from Yair Lapid's party are saying for that, they should be branded as terrorist organizations. Nothing, it's all excused, the violence from the left, blocking roads, blocking highways, attacking drivers, attacking people. Everything that they do is fine as far as left-wing politicians are concerned. The minute you step up and yell back or answer back, give a slogan back at a protest, they want you locked up in jail.
Okay. Can I address that, please?
Sure. Yes.
Okay. Your brilliant tech support man behind the scenes right there, that Wizard of Oz, has a 2-minute video, which I think he is prepared to play.
Okay.
If he does, let me just give an introduction, if I may. We'll watch it. It's in Hebrew, but one doesn't really have to. I will, in essence, give you the bullet points of what he says, accurate to the words which were spoken. But it's the tone that you've described so accurately. This venom that's been directed against the right wing, the religious right, the religious parties in Israel. The piece that we're about to see is 2 minutes long. It is a speech that is screamed out in the Knesset by a member of Yesh Atid. It's Michal Shir. Michal Shir, 3.5 years ago, was a member of Likud. Then she decided she was going to move on. She moved from Likud to Yesh Atid. Excuse me. She moved on to Tikva Chadasha, the New Hope, with Gidon Sar, and then she moved on to Yesh Atid. She's with Yesh Atid. What she has done in the past, just to give you perspective, this woman who we're about to see referred to Yair Lapid, who she supports quite strongly today. She referred to him, and I'm quoting her, as an amateur, as a worthless amateur who is incompetent and needs to be silenced. Okay, this is what Michal Shir said about Yair Lapid. Yair Lapid, of course, at the forefront of the anti-government demonstrations today. She launches into a little tirade, which I think we'll watch right now, which is directed at Bibi Netanyahu, at the Likud, and other members of the coalition. I will let Gary play it, and then I will tell you exactly what she said for those who don't speak Hebrew.
Okay.
היום עלה ראש ממשלה בישראל
There we go.
למסיבת עיתונאים לא פחות.
Oh boy.
אחרי שהרחובות נשרפים פה 12 שבועות ברציפות. אחרי שאנשים יצאו ספונטנית, אחרי שהוא פיתח.
Oh boy.
Okay, well, Mayor, break it down. What's she saying?
Okay.
שר ביטחון שאמר את האמת על מלחמה רב חזיתית.
How she says it is as important as what she
a couple
says.
of minutes, keep talking, and I'll get a better quality on while you're talking, but it'll take about 5 minutes. So talk away, and then we'll put her back on.
Well, the power of this presentation would have been, if you notice the photo right now on screen, is the manner with which she did this, the histrionics. It was an unhinged, deranged political position taken from the rostrum at the Knesset, in which she screams and barks out this hatred for this government. Again, this, if someone doesn't understand Hebrew, watching how and what she does is enough to sort of put in perspective the madness that underscores what they are.
היום עלה ראש ממשלה בישראל למסיבת עיתונאים לא פחות, אחרי שהרחובות נשרפים פה 12 שבועות ברציפות, אחרי שאנשים יצאו ספונטנית, אחרי שהוא פיטר שר ביטחון שאמר את האמת על מלחמה רב חזיתית. אנשים יצאו לרחובות, אנשים יצאו כדי להילחם על החיים שלהם, והוא, החצוף הזה, יוצא למסיבת עיתונאים זחוח, קורא לאנשי ימין, קורא לאנשי התיישבות, צאו להפגין, תבואו, תשפכו פה דם. מי אתה שאתה תשפוך פה את הדם שלנו? הדם של המפגינים על הידיים שלך ורק על שלך, כי שופך פה דם. אתה איש חסר אחריות, אתה איש שהוא בושה בהיסטוריה של מדינת ישראל. זה מה שאתה. צריך לעצור אותך על הסתה, צריך לעצור אותך על אלימות, צריך לעצור אותך על הדם שישפך פה, צריך פשוט לעצור אותך. אתה איש מסוכן, אין לך גבולות, הוכחת את זה היום. אנחנו לא נעצור, מר נתניהו. אתה מסכן אותנו, אתה מסכן את הילדים שלנו, אתה מגזים. שולח מפגינים, לאן אתה קורא להם? ועוד אחר כך אומר בזהירות, לא, שלא ישפך לכם פה דם, לא. תגיד לי, רמת הצביעות שלך, עד איפה היא מגיעה? חוסר האכפתיות שלך לעם שלך, עד איפה הוא מגיע? ואז שמעתי עוד דבר, שהוא לוקח את השר לכלום לאומי כדי להגיד לו את המילה, שימו לב לזה, להשהיה הוא לוקח אותו, ומה הוא עושה? נותן לו להקים פה את השטאזי. ואתם הליכוד נותנים לו לעשות את זה. אתם אשמים כמוהו. כל אחד ואחד שיושב בספסלים האלה של הקואליציה, אתם כתם.
תודה רבה.
What a lovely, lovely soul. This is a deranged woman. Hold on, let me strike her off my to-date list. Okay. A deranged woman. Here, let me tell you in essence what she said. And I'm going to, I wrote these points down, verbatim, what she said. And you have to understand, I'm going to read them to you as opposed to scream them at you. And if you notice, she did it to a Knesset, the chamber, which was almost empty. And the reason I thought it was important that we watch this has gone viral. It's gone viral. And the people who don't like Benjamin Netanyahu applaud the fact that she has lost her mind calling for his removal. But let me tell you what she said. She begins by saying, our prime minister held a press conference while the streets were ablaze with demonstrators. And she said, for 12 straight weeks, people have taken to the streets to defend their very lives. All lies. She yells to him, who are you? You're a stain in this country. Who are you? They should arrest you for incitement. They should arrest you for violence. They should arrest you because of all the blood that you have spilled. You are the greatest embarrassment. You're the greatest embarrassment in the history of Israel. They need to arrest you because you are, and she barks out, a dangerous man. You have no limits. You will not, and then she says, we will not stop, Mr. Netanyahu. You endanger us. You endanger our children. Your hypocrisy knows no limits. You don't care about your own people. You create, this is remarkable, you create a secret police to stop the protesters. You dismiss the opposition and you take the Likud with you. And then she turns to the few people sitting in the chamber and she says, every one of you who sits here is as part of this coalition. and she barks out, "You are a stain! You are a stain!" And she, of course, moves on. I don't know if there was a psychiatrist or some very serious medication waiting for her as she walked off. The reason I asked that this be shown was not only to show the venom of the side that lost democratically, but to bring up another point. In the last 5 weeks in Israel, there have been 15 murders of Jews. There have been 15 murders of Jews. Sitting in the Knesset beside this witch, yeah, that's what I said, witch. Sitting in the Knesset beside this woman are Arab parliamentarians, elected also democratically, who don't recognize Israel's right to exist, who, using language which is beyond euphemisms, applaud the murder of other Jews. They refer to those terrorists who perpetrated those crimes against Jews as martyrs. They go visit their families to console them if, in fact, they were neutralized by the Israeli authorities. Of these people, of these actions, she has nothing to say. Not once has she taken to the rostrum and condemned the murder of Jews. Not once. Not once. But when Bibi Netanyahu, elected democratically, and his coalition want to introduce legislation which suggests that the Supreme Court not be allowed to overstep the rules which were initially established in formation of the State of Israel, she loses her mind and demands that he be arrested because he has blood on his hand. No, 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 sweet lady. The blood is on the hands of your Arab colleagues, and it needs to be called out.
Absolutely. You know, I'm wondering how far the left is ready to go with their campaign of hate. I mean, they hate the religious Jews. They see that demographic growing, and it's unstoppable. Are they going to propose sterilization? I mean, it sounds far-fetched to even bring it up, but when you watch the hate and the venom coming from them, I don't think it's so far-fetched that they would use other words to maybe mean the same thing. What do you think about that?
Politicians, including former generals, Yair Golan, former generals sitting in the Knesset with the Meretz party. You have others. You have two previous prime ministers, Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert, who basically just 2.5, 3 weeks ago called for violence in the street, called for bloodshed, said that there needs to be an upheaval and an uprising way beyond civil strife. The mayor of Tel Aviv, Ron Hudayi, also comes out and calls for violence in the street, and no one says anything. She supports them. They were representing her voice. The issue that needs to be discussed here, and I think it's a discussion, I think, for a future show perhaps also. There is now a ceasefire of sorts. Bibi Netanyahu, this is my editorial comment, surrendered to what was happening in the streets. He said that we were going to go through with it. They have the votes, and the reason he surrendered was twofold. One, members of the Likud party, his own party, showed weak knees. They basically said maybe we should look for some kind of compromise. The moment that they first said we need to find a compromise, it emboldened the left. They became ever more vocal. They became more violent in their opposition of what Bibi was planning on doing. That was the first thing. The second thing is, it wasn't just that members of his own party said, let's take a break, or the word that they use is, let's soften the legislation. Let's offer a softened version of judicial reform. And all of a sudden, the left became violent. Demonstrations and this and the threats and the like. Here's the thing that we all know. Anyone who studies political science at whatever level, understands the following: that if the opposition sees you as losing your fight, if the opposition sees that you will bend, that you will sacrifice your ideological stance on which you built everything that you represent, it makes them stronger. The notion that, and we had Israel's president try to intervene and say, let's in fact compromise. They didn't want to compromise, the left. Now the left is saying, yes, let's compromise, because they have read the situation as such that the compromise will mean that the concessions will come from the other side and not from their side. The Israeli president, when he called for compromise, he represented he still does. He represents, and his position, mind you, for those out there who don't know, is simply ceremonial. But he, in fact, represents what they did. Behind the scenes, they have all said, all the people on the left, those vocal, venomous voices, have all said, we're not giving up this fight. This fight ends with two things happening. And some of them were quite candid about the latter, about the second. The first one is that there'll be no judicial reform. We're not going to allow it. And the second one was, we're not going to allow Bibi Netanyahu to be prime minister. And that is the essence of what this is about. This is as in America, we have the anyone but Trump syndrome. We have in Israel the anyone but Bibi syndrome. The election is pro-Bibi and anti-Bibi. They now see for the first time, this is the parties you mentioned, this is a collection of parties on the left that they represent a minority in Israel. Take away the Arab vote, they represent a much smaller minority. And yet they are the vocal ones, and the ones who are capitulating, and there's no question about it, is the so-called right wing, Bibi Netanyahu. If in fact Bibi tells us, as he did, that he believes that once we regroup and examine this and move on with judicial reform in May, if he thinks that the left will somehow have gone away, if he thinks that the left is surrendering this fight, they aren't. He's in for a surprise. And those people on the right who are very disappointed in Bibi Netanyahu, I guess one might say that I am among them. We believe that Bibi wants this thing to go away, and he has no intention of driving it the way it was driven just a week ago, 2 weeks ago, by his Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin. This is, in my read, and I think the read of others who are astute enough to see what's happening, a tremendous victory, and I don't think that it's temporary right now for the left. And it's a defeat for the government that was elected democratically. It's terrible.
Okay, well, this is where we are right now, that now there's these so-called negotiations going on. I will say this, that I have seen, aside from all the garbage going on with these left-wing protests and threats and violence and everything else, I pay a lot of attention to the Temple Mount, and especially during Ramadan right now. And I have seen, and since Itamar Ben-Gvir is the minister in charge of the police, that I have seen some good action from him regarding the Temple Mount in terms of incitement. There was a rally there, Hamas rally, and it was quickly broken up by the police. I remember last year, it was like on a daily basis that Jews walking through the Damascus Gate were attacked. Right now, it seems to be a little bit different. There's a lot more police that are deployed there. It still isn't over. It's early in the stage right now, but I do see Ben-Gvir taking some action. I see Smotrich seems to be on the ball. Their parties are only going to get stronger as we move forward. How do you see the right coming out of this whole situation, anyways?
Yeah, I'm not as optimistic as you are, Mayor. The reason I think Hamas is quiet is because they're watching their enemy fight among themselves. There's no question in my mind that is the case. The fact that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir want to do the right thing, there's no question about that. The fact that we've seen a couple of really good groups fighting to bring more hours, the Jews can visit the Temple Mount, remarkable that we're actually petitioning the government, a Jewish government, to allow Jews a few additional hours in order to pray on the holiest of holies. It's insane. The problem is that and this is where Bibi has not been our best friend. Even Bibi has somewhat, he has kept at bay as much as possible the Smotrich and Ben Gvir philosophies. There are those in Israel who say, and I don't believe that they're fully wrong, that if Bibi Netanyahu could put together a national unity government, as long as he was prime minister, he would do it in conjunction with Lapid and Benny Gantz, whatever. And there was the thinking, in fact, when they were negotiating positions in ministries, they were afraid that that is what he was going to do. That will not happen now. And the reason it won't happen now is the left now sees Bibi more vulnerable than ever before. More vulnerable than ever before. And there's no way in the world that they're going to allow him or be in government with him where he's the prime minister. He's on his own, which means that he now has no option but to align himself with the right wing. But in doing so, he's losing Israel's version of the rhinos, those Knesset members who, here it is, he fired, even though it's not yet hasn't been implemented by Israeli law. There has to be the written and the 48 hours of it. It wasn't not until the 72nd hour before, but he fired Israel's defense minister, who basically, in a volte-face and about-face, turns around and basically says, I think we should give up this notion of judicial reform. And that comes from, well, when the left sees this, the left is empowered. And I think the left is riding this tremendous wave, which they hope to turn. They hope to turn into a tsunami against this government. The left wing believes that Bibi's days, his government, are in short number. And mind you, the Knesset breaks in April. The holidays, they reconvene again in May. And when they do, Bibi Netanyahu is not going to be in any better position than he is today. There are other issues. I have a newspaper. I see the clock is ticking. I just want to pull out a piece from yesterday's news, for example. And it just shows you that the battle that we're fighting, this war of ideas, goes much beyond just the Supreme Court. Here it is, a story. I'm sure many out there know the story, that a member of the religious Zionist party, Tzvi Sukkot, is introducing a bill which basically says, it's a law which basically says that monies, government monies, should not be used to sponsor this thing which they've been doing for a number of years now. On Israel's Memorial Day, these liberal leftists in Israel hold what they consider a joint Memorial Day ceremony. Now, for 75 years, Israel has on Yom HaZikaron mourned those who died establishing and defending the state of Israel, followed by the next day by Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel's Independence Day. Well, the leftists have decided to join with the Arabs and said, not only have Jews fallen in the war between Israel and the Arabs, but Arabs, the Arab attackers of the Jews, have also lost. And every year now, they have joint ceremony in which they read the names, not only of Israelis who fell, of Arabs who fell while killing Jews. Now, obviously, I should have had Gary, your technician, prepare the Twilight Zone music, because that's what it requires. This is insanity on steroids is what it is. And yet they will proceed. There's going to be this year a joint Memorial Day ceremony in which they will collectively mourn Jews and the Arab murderers who fell. This sort of underscores the mentality of the left. This isn't something, we're not talking about a difference of opinion. We're talking about those people who dedicated their lives to preserving the state of Israel as a Jewish state, and those who are dedicating their political ideology to destroying exactly that. And I've said before, it's interesting, when I've lectured, I said that if one draws a straight line between optimism and pessimism, when I lecture, some people seem to think that I'm a pessimist, because I often say that we're in trouble. And I argue that I'm not a pessimist. There is something that falls in between optimism and pessimism. It's called realism. Realism is calling a spade a spade. And when you do that, because the news often is not good, you're considered a naysayer. Churchill was a naysayer. Neville Chamberlain wanted peace. Churchill said, don't fool yourselves. So Chamberlain was considered the prophet of peace, and Churchill the naysayer. We live in a world, the Western world, that sometimes has lost its common sense. I've written more than one piece in which I've made reference to common sense on life support. And in Israel today, we see it more often and more frequently and more violently than we had before. I think it was in a previous broadcast which I mentioned that it was Menachem Begin, who in 1951, 1952, and it ended in 53, was fighting in the Knesset against German reparations, suggesting it was blood money. When you read the speech, as brilliant and as articulate as it is, he said, "We will not allow this to happen. We will not allow this to happen." And he said, on the other
You're traveling through another dimension.
Exactly right. It's exactly right. I know as Rabbi Kahana said that, well, you've got to maintain a sense of humor because otherwise all is lost. All is lost. But we've got to come to terms with it. I look at the clock and I realize we're running out of time. But there's another issue which we've not even addressed, is that America is absolute America, the American administration, the Biden administration. And mind you, he's nothing more than the puppet. It's the puppeteers who run Biden. He doesn't know how to get from one room into the other. The mental acuity of a baked potato, but nonetheless smart enough to follow instructions, which is that Bibi Netanyahu is not the friend to America, and America is certainly not going to be a friend to Bibi Netanyahu. And when his handlers, Thomas Knives, who's the American ambassador to Israel, basically said that soon Bibi Netanyahu will finally get an invitation to visit the White House, it was immediately overruled by the State Department, and even more so by Joe Biden, who basically said, no, it's not going to happen soon. They realized that the momentum, that the shift, the way they read it, is against Bibi Netanyahu, and they don't want to give him any credibility by meeting and having a photo op with the President of the United States. And Bibi, what does Bibi do? Bibi turns around and says, Joe has been my friend for 40 years. We're good friends. No. It's a mistake, Bibi. I know you're smart. It's a terrible mistake. What you need to say is, I cannot believe that a friend of Israel's for 40 years would do this, would stab Israel in the back. For 40 years, we thought that you understood our situation, and now you betray us. That's what he should say.
Right. Look, what we're discussing is that those on the left, they are against the very foundations of Israel. If you put them up, if you look at the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, they fit it. They
Correct.
fit right in there.
Correct.
They are mourning those who murder Jews. They are calling for boycotts of Israel. They're calling for divestment of Israel. That's BDS. They are protesting outside of synagogues. That's rabid anti-Semitism. There was a video that went viral of some anti-Semitic nutjob in Florida that went outside a Chabad synagogue, and he spoke with venom against the Jews. Now, it's one thing that nobody from the synagogue, from the shul, did anything against this anti-Semite, and it would be completely justified to take measures and do something about this anti-Semite, be it as it may. He's outside a synagogue with his anti-Semitism. In Israel, I see these left-wingers outside of synagogues throwing money at Orthodox Jews, women taking their tops off, to ridicule Orthodox Jews, screaming at them, threatening them. That's the left. And maybe the term has to change, because when you say left wing and right wing, it sounds kind of like polite. Oh, you have a difference of opinion. There's no difference of opinion. Those who are for a Jewish state and those who are against that.
Well,
And the ones against it will use everything that they have.
if you know your political theory, the political ideology that's pervaded by the left is in every sense fascist. It's fascist. I don't know when these amateurs came up. Fascist is right wing. No, it was not. It's a fascist. It's a left. The point that you make about these nut job, as you call them in Florida outside, well, if one wants to find the venom of the nut job, let's just go to Congress. Now, and I'm leading to a point here. Ilhan Omer, AOC, Rashida Tlaib, these are people voted for with, by the way, Jewish dollars. The Jews have contributed to the coffers of the Democratic National Party by a factor many-fold. Most of the money that's raised by the Democratic National Convention and the committee is Jewish dollars, despite the fact that the Jews are only 1.8% of the population in America. But I want to make a point, and forgive me, I have another engagement. It might be my closing thought. There's a very simple barometer that one could take. It's a very simple barometer. In Israel, we have these people demonstrating against the government. They've taken to the street. As I said, some of the people who are demonstrating can't even articulate why it is that they're in the street. They just want to bring Bibi down. If one notices who are their allies, in Israel, their allies are the Arabs. In Israel, their allies is the academic element, which has been so anti-Jewish state. In the rest of the Western world, who are their allies? Some of the people that I've mentioned, Rashida Tlaib. You're talking about the people who are on record as having a hatred for Israel. They don't support judicial reform in Israel, which is a representation of democracy. They want the end of Bibi Netanyahu's government. So if there was a clear thinker, if an intellectual integrity meant anything, and you said to someone on the left who attends one of the demonstrations in Tel Aviv, I'm going to give you a list of people, organizations, and countries that support your position completely. And you showed them a list of people who are virulently anti-Semitic, who are virulently anti-Israel, who want to see Israel eliminated. And I don't mean that middle ground who misunderstand what the two-state solution is. They actually believe it's a solution as opposed to an illusion or delusion. I'm talking about people who have an open hatred for Israel, who call for the eradication of the state of Israel. And you ask the demonstrator, you realize that they support what you do? Does that make them scratch their head and think, whoa, maybe something is amiss here? And the answer is no. And the answer, don't think about it for a reason. Once again, this is an op-ed or a lecture, both that I've given. It's under the title of The Myth of Jewish Intelligence. Tragically.
No kidding.
Tragically.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
There's for sure. Well, there we go.
We have met the enemy and he is us.
Yes.
Yes, Sherlock.
Well, Mayor, we'll take it up on another show. There's a lot to discuss. It's all unfolding.
Yes.
Possibly next week we'll continue with this, in fact, before Pesach. But listen, thank you very much for sharing your information, knowledge on the topic with all of us. And we'll be sharing the YouTube video. We'll be sending it out, sharing it on social media, and we'll reach a lot of people with it. So this message is very important, very vital at this time.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for joining us, Mayor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oops.
Yes.
Hey, before we go, Mayor, Mayor, this was a great show. Thanks a lot. So we're about to end our live show, but when the live show is over, I'm going to play, for instance, an 8-minute synopsis of how the courts were taken over by the liberal progressives many years ago. And it won't be live. It'll be recording. Anybody wants to watch it can, but the live show is about to be over. So, Mayor, we'll see you soon. And Mayor, closing comments.
Well, just we're at it. I'm proud to say that every week for the past, I think, 5 weeks already, we've been having a live Torah Parsha of the week from the Temple Mount. We have Baruch Ben Yosef, who is there on the Temple Mount, and we are giving the information, giving the interpretation, showing that Torah learning and Torah study should return to the Temple Mount, and that's what we're doing. That's one of our campaigns, and we're consistent with it. And also our live broadcasts about issues that affect the Jewish people. We're moving forward with that. And there's other campaigns that we're involved with, fighting against anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and we get the truth out in the best way we can. I would say that those who are watching or will watch later when you receive the YouTube video, if you could please go on our website. If you want to help us out, you want to contribute there our website is israelnow.ca, and also if you could make a donation, we'd appreciate it. There are some expenses incurred in this work, and there's a lot that we have to do. In fact, as we get closer to in Toronto, there's going to be the Walk for Israel. Oops. It's going to be the Walk for Israel in Toronto coming up in May. And last year there were anti-Israel groups, BDS, anti-Semitic groups who are burning Israeli flags. So we're going to be prepared for that. I was in Israel at the time last year when that happened. And we're working on it. So we could use your support for that. So please go on our website. Again, it's israelnow.ca, and get involved with us. Help us out. Again, thank you very much for joining us, and please share this. Thank you. Shalom.